2024年是全球大选年，其中美国大选是最令全世界感到焦虑的一场选举。曾经有人开玩笑地说，世界上其他国家的人民完全没有美国选举的投票资格，可是却比美国人更关心这场选举结果。
This is, for Donald Trump, a message to voters that he will do what it takes in order to ensure that U.S. manufacturing stays here at home and that foreign companies move production here to the U.S. mainland. We saw this play out in 2018 and 2019 when he placed selective tariffs on some goods coming from places like France, other European countries, Mexico, Canada. But then he also is threatening to put a far-reaching tariffs of 200% on Chinese goods. We saw, when you're looking at agricultural goods, the price of soybeans, of corn, all plummet. We saw U.S. exports go down because of the retaliatory tariffs that places like China put on U.S. exports. So we're talking about potential far-reaching impacts to the U.S. economy if Donald Trump were to go forward with the tariffs that
Vice President Kamala Harris, in making her case, said that the tariff plans that Donald Trump is proposing will hurt the middle class. Here's what she said specifically, quote,
Sure.
He intends to enact what in effect is a national sales tax, call it a Trump tax, that would raise prices on middle-class families by almost $4,000 a year. Well, let's talk about
Sure.
Trump's record during his first term. He did impose rounds of tariffs, and it cost Americans nearly $80 billion in new taxes. Do you acknowledge that imposing more tariffs will ultimately cost consumers?
Well, what it really does is it penalizes importers from bringing goods outside the country into the country. And I think that's just a necessary thing.
But it caused consumers to pay more. They paid more in taxes, $80 billion worth. Do you acknowledge that consumers ultimately will pay more if there are more tariffs imposed?
So economists...
Do you just acknowledge that?
No, I don't, Kristen, because I think economists really disagree about the effects of tariffs because there can be a dynamic effect, right? So what some economists will say is what you just said, that it will actually raise costs for consumers. But what other people say, and I think the record supports what this other view, is that it causes this dynamic effect where more jobs come into the country. Anything that you lose on the tariff from the perspective of the consumer, you gain in higher wages. So you're ultimately much better off. You have more take-home pay, you have better jobs, and also we have more reliance.
And it is economists across the board, really. I mean, the Wall Street Journal says economic data showed that Donald Trump's trade war with China did not achieve its objectives of reversing the declines in U.S. manufacturing or reshoring factory jobs. I hear what you're saying. It's a complicated picture, but just on that bottom line point, you can't guarantee that Americans won't wind up paying a penny more, can you?
Well, I think that what you can guarantee is that if you don't bring more manufacturing jobs back into this country, you don't make our supply chains more stable, you're going to cause higher prices over the long term. I think that is what is absolutely true.
But you acknowledge they could wind up paying more?
What I acknowledge, Kristen, is that unless we bring more manufacturing jobs back to this country, we are going to end up paying more in the long term.
And I actually want to start with a headline that was made just yesterday by former President Trump, because I think we're all trying to understand his plans as they relate to tariffs. I'm sure you saw that one of the things that he said was that he plans to put a 200% tariff on John Deere tractors if, in fact, they were to move them and manufacture them in Mexico as opposed to here in the U.S. Obviously, he has a broader plan around tariffs as well. So as an investor and somebody who's on Trump's side, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I think Trump's tariff plans are well-founded. When you look at the economists, they like the concept of free trade, but we don't live in a free trade world. U.S. has minimal barriers to import into the U.S., but we face substantial both financial, tariff, and non-tariff barriers when we try and export. So as a result, in 2022, we had a $1.2 trillion merchandise trade deficit. We've lost thousands of factories, millions of jobs to foreigners because of the unfair trade competition. So what Trump wants to do is create an American manufacturing powerhouse and using tariffs as a way to level the playing field. So in the case of Deere, we now have a merchandise trade deficit of $150 billion with Mexico. Many U.S. factories are closing U.S. plants. relocating to Mexico, taking advantage of the cheap labor, and then importing the goods duty-free back in the U.S. What does that do for America? So by using tariffs strategically, we can strengthen American manufacturing and increase real wages for American workers.
川普在当美国总统之前是个身经百战的商人，商场上的算计尔虞我诈，什么样的手段，在这个曾经开过好几季综艺节目、传授经营手法的大神面前，应该都看过了。所以，当川普不停向美国选民传递关税是他未来确保带领美国制造业回流的最强大武器时，他不是在呼口号，而是把国家看成一个企业。这个企业可以跟你谈购并，可以跟你谈技术交换，可以跟你谈在地投资，以减轻你必须缴交的税额，换取双方想要的利益。但是，你要是想借壳上市，换个公司名字，改个包装，前进美国赚钱，川普说税更重，你可以试一试。这种威吓的语气已经成功延迟了美国大企业 John Deere 强路公司赴墨西哥的投资案。可说到底，川普的关税政策之于美国经济，究竟是一帖救命猛药，还是一剂让美国经济日泻千里的泻药？其他国家又是如何看待关税这个议题？
But what we know about, President Trump is, one, he believes in tariffs. He's been talking about tariffs since the 1980s, but he did follow through with that. He can do much of this unilaterally. I think you fast forward to a Trump 2.0, the aperture is going to be much wider. It's going to be on things like Mexican cars or German cars or Japan or Ireland, other countries where the trade deficit has actually increased. And so the aperture will be much wider. Tariffs are going to be increasing not only just on China, but on other countries as well.
What does that mean for inflation? What does that mean actually with the composition of the economy?
Yeah, so the market, is really focused on the potential inflationary impacts of tariffs, and that's for good reason. But also, the thing about tariffs is it cuts both ways. It can also be a headwind to U.S. growth in terms of demand destruction on the consumer side, but also impacting the export economy, export sectors in the U.S. as well. So, again, hard to tell and hard to feign precision here, because so much of this will depend on who he puts in his cabinet, what he actually follows through with. But again, the direction of travel here is clear.
I mean, a lot, if you look at the charts, a lot has already, manufacturing has gone back to the U.S. And actually, what does it mean for U.S. exceptionalism longer term?
So U.S. exceptionalism is built around excessive fiscal policy, right? We're already running a 6-7% fiscal deficit. You look at where the deficit will be headed if we do see tax cuts that are due to expire at the end of next year extended. I think this is often the piece that investors are missing. People point to the weakness in Europe, the weakness in emerging markets, and talk about how the U.S. economy is just the standout. And the piece that we miss here is that it's being built on, frankly, unsustainable levels of debt. In a normal election cycle, you'd be looking at this debate and expecting a much clearer focus on how either side is going to try and fix the hole in the federal finances. And instead, we have this scenario where both sides of the aisle are looking for more expansive fiscal policy next year. So this isn't a clear call for higher Treasury yields. Ultimately, inflation will be the driver, but I do think it gives you a much wider range of outcomes.
You're going to see big differences on trade between a Harris administration and a Trump administration. I think the key things for people in Canada to focus on is, while Harris would probably be more continuity from the Biden administration when it comes to trade, Trump administration, Trump 2.0 will look different than Trump 1.0. Trump 1.0, there were tariffs, but there was a big debate within the administration of whether to put them on and how much to put them on. This time around, Trump sees tariffs as a versatile tool that solves all the issues that he would be focused on, and he will be looking to use it wherever possible, not just as leverage, but as an end in and of itself. The most important things, I believe, for Canada would be, on the trade front, would be the threat of a universal baseline tariff, and also July of 2026, you have what we call the U.S. MCA, but I believe you guys put the C first. But in any event, that is a agreement comes up for review, and Trump undoubtedly would use brinksmanship and the threat of pulling out of it to try to extract some concessions, which would put a nice cloud of uncertainty over the business community in Canada for the next couple of years.
Laura, do you have the sense that Chinese authorities have a preference between Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
So, one of my favorite quotes from an analyst that I got in the last few months was that they felt that it was a choice between two bowls of poison. That's China's prevailing view when it comes to the US presidential election. They don't see anything changing anytime soon.
Now, we know that the European Union was following in the footsteps of the United States and Canada in increasing those tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, hoping to create a more level playing field for their domestic producers. Is this really an effective tactic to boost competition within the EV market?
Well, in the United States, we certainly think so. What we've seen from China is not just massive subsidies and support from the state, but it's really a directive. It's in China's planning and economic policy documents that this is an industry they are targeting to be a leader in the future. And unfortunately, it comes at the expense of other economies. And so, for the U.S. and for Canada, the policymakers are trying to get ahead of what we've seen in solar, steel, and under other industries of China being successful in achieving those objectives. And importantly, for the United States and Canada, we're seeing an even higher tariff level, 100%. And I think it is that really high tariff level that will ensure and promote a level playing field.
This is a difficult time because there is a contraction of the European market and a very strong Chinese competition. And I think we need them at this time in order to protect ourselves and be at a level playing field.
Chinese manufacturer BYD began importing to Europe 3 years ago. It's now one of the top electric car sellers in the bloc. The company says the tariffs will hit European buyers.
I think it's not fair to European consumer because with all the inflation, it's a challenge for them. So we'll continue working hard to deliver the best technology, high-tech technology.
Some EU countries, including Germany, fear China will retaliate with extra duties on their car imports. But in France, where 1 in 3 electric cars sold is Chinese, some car makers hope the move will help.
We have to face it in the same way that we face any hiccups that could appear in the industry. So specifically the Chinese car makers, they are extremely competitive in cost because of their supply chain and things like that. So we have to answer that.
Both the EU and China say they want to avoid a full-blown trade war. One option, says this analyst, could be for Chinese companies to build cars in Europe.
What will be the solution, and it seems that this is what Chinese are doing in Europe, is having their own factories in Europe, as Japan did in the 70s, as South Korea did in the 80s.
关税是一把双面刃。当川普会向其他对美贸易逆差的国家实施时，对美国不可能不造成内伤。因此，有不少经济学家认为，疯狂的 Trumponomics 2.0 会对美国与全世界造成无法预期的伤害。华尔街日报为此在 YouTube 频道上制作了一个专题，引用美国历史上著名的关税经典例子，提到2战之后，欧洲对美国征收肉鸡进口关税，造成美国鸡农的获利下降，引起政客关注。所以，美国针对当时欧洲最大的美国肉鸡进口市场，德国实施报复性关税。之后，由德国进口进入美国销售的卡车，都被征收 25% 的关税。这使得德国汽车业受到重创。直到今天，德国卡车在美国的销售市场上依然没有恢复关税上路前的荣景。
It's kind of a perfect example of what tariffs do. Hurt consumers while protecting very specific industries, or attempt to get countries to change their behavior. While they haven't been a large part of trade policy in decades, former President Donald Trump wants to change that.
Some might say it's economic nationalism. I call it common sense. I call it America first.
President Trump has really sort of brought a lot of people out to think that tariffs might be something that's useful in America's economic arsenal in a way that hasn't been used in the past.
The study found the U.S. collected $82 million annually. But because of those price increases, it cost consumers $1.5 billion more. So they basically paid $815,000 per job.
This is a very expensive job creation program. And so that's another reason why economists don't like tariffs. They're much more cost-effective, more efficient ways of increasing employment in those industries.
许多人对川普关税的解读是，就算为美国保留了就业机会，相对美国消费者也将为其付出昂贵的代价。但是，川普始终想做的从来没有变过。
Mexico has taken over a period of 30 years, 34% of the automobile manufacturing business in our country. Think of it, went to Mexico. China now is building a couple of massive plants where they're going to build the cars in Mexico and they think that they're going to sell those cars into the United States with no tax at the border. Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. No, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. They're building big, giant auto plants in Mexico, owned and financed by China, and they think they're going to come out and they're going to build cars and they're going to sell them into our country and they're going to destroy Michigan and all these other places. Not going to happen because we'll put 100 to 200% tariff on every car coming across the Mexican border.
川普希望竞争者到美国投资设厂、生产制造、贩售商品，但不允许竞争者钻漏洞进入美国市场赚钱。这个想法将改变企业对全球的布局。事实上，撇开美国的因素，从新冠疫情打乱全球运输与供应链之后，在地投资已经是现在进行式。只是横亘在我们眼前的问题是，当川普回归白宫之前，在2025年到来之后，我们是否已经培养好优秀的经贸谈判专家，以应付未来10年、20年的命运走向
？You look at the American economy, 40 million jobs rely on trade. It counts for 27% of GDP.
Okay.
If you cut that off, that's also going to have an effect on many, many business people here.
Yeah.
Tariffs also have another side. Isn't that something that you have to acknowledge?
No.
You could be plunging America into the biggest trade war since Smoot-Hawley.
But there are no tariffs.
You're going to stop. There are tariffs already at the moment.
There are no tariffs. All you have to do is build your plant in the United States and you don't have any tariffs.
Critics say your tariffs will end up being like a national sales tax.
No.
Because
the countries
if you have America at the moment has $3 trillion worth of imports, you're going to add tariffs to every single one of them. That is going to push up the cost for all those people who want to buy foreign goods.
No. What's going to happen?
That is just simple mathematics, President Trump.
It's not. Yeah, it is, but not the way you figure it. I was always very good at mathematics.
Yes.
Let me tell you, you're saying $3 trillion.
That's $3 trillion worth of imports.
And they don't have to pay. And if the higher the tariff, the more likely it is to have them come into the country.
The higher the tariff, the more you're going to put on the value of that piece, those goods, the higher people are going to have to pay in shops.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
Many people would say the biggest problem with your tariffs is actually geopolitics. You, in your first term, you got some credit for effectively saying that there was a Cold War against China. That's what America was in. If you look at the last Cold War against the Soviet Union, America won it in part because it rallied allies to it. You're talking about slamming allies with 30%, 20% tariffs. Isn't this time you're going to end up trying to rally the West and you're dividing it instead? Isn't that the real problem with tariffs, even beyond all the problems due to the economy, where you keep on bringing up these individual examples, but the overall effect is going to be dramatic. You are going to annoy the people you need to rally behind you.
But our allies have taken advantage of us more so than our enemies. Our allies are the European Union. We have a trade deficit of $300 billion with the European Union. We have trade deals that were so bad